The house still echoes with her laughter, though Margaret has been gone for 3 months now. Every morning, I wake expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen, the gentle clatter of her favorite coffee mug against the marble counter. But there's only silence, a profound, aching quiet that seems to seep into my bones and settle there like winter frost. 47 years of marriage doesn't prepare you for the emptiness that follows. The way her reading glasses still sit on the nightstand, waiting. How her lavender perfume lingers in the closets, growing fainter each day, like a whispered goodbye. I find myself talking to her photographs, asking what she'd think about the neighbor's new fence, or whether she remembers where we kept the Christmas decorations. Friends tell me it's time to start organizing her things, as they delicately put it. But how do you organize a lifetime? How do you decide which memories deserve to stay and which should be packed away in boxes? Margaret's presence fills every corner of this house. Her handwritten recipes taped inside cabinet doors, her books with pages folded at meaningful passages, her garden tools still dirty from the last tomatoes she planted. The grief comes in waves, unexpected and overwhelming. One moment I'm fine, making breakfast for one, and the next I'm crying over the way she used to leave little notes in my lunch bag. "Have a wonderful day, my love." Simple words that meant everything, now just echoes in my memory. The counselor says this is normal, that love after 50 runs deeper than younger hearts can fathom. But it was yesterday, while searching for our old tax documents in the attic, that I discovered something that would change everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd shared nearly half a century with. Hidden behind a dusty box of Christmas ornaments, I found something that made my hands tremble. A small wooden box I'd never seen before, tucked away in the darkest corner of our attic. My heart pounded as I recognized it. The jewelry box her mother had given her on our wedding day. The one she claimed had been lost during our move to this house 30 years ago. Margaret had mourned its disappearance, or so I thought. Yet here it was, deliberately hidden, waiting. The brass latch opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the dusty attic space. Inside, beneath the faded silk lining, were letters. Not just any letters, dozens of them, written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Each envelope addressed to me, but never sent. My name written in her familiar script, over and over, like a prayer or a confession she could never bring herself to speak aloud. The dates on the envelopes spanned decades. The earliest was from 1978, just 3 years into our marriage. The most recent was dated just 2 weeks before the cancer finally took her. My hands shook as I realized what I was holding. Secret letters from my own wife, emotional stories she'd never shared, thoughts and feelings she'd kept locked away for nearly our entire life together. I carefully lifted the first letter, its paper yellowed with age. The envelope felt fragile, like it might crumble if I handled it too roughly. Part of me wondered if I had the right to read these private thoughts, these words she'd chosen to keep hidden. But another part of me, the part that had been drowning in grief and memory, desperately needed to hear her voice again. Settling into the old rocking chair by the attic window, I opened that first letter, unprepared for the journey back through time it would take me on. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty glass, and for a moment, I could almost feel Margaret beside me, guiding me towards truths I'd never imagined existed. "My dearest Robert," the first letter began, "there are things I should have told you today, but couldn't find the courage." The date was March 15th, 1978. I remembered that day clearly. It was the anniversary of our first date, and we'd celebrated at the little Italian restaurant where we'd shared our first meal together. Margaret had seemed distant that evening, distracted. Now I understood why. "When you asked me about children again tonight, I saw the hope in your eyes, and I couldn't bear to break your heart. The truth is, I went to Dr. Hamilton last week. The tests confirmed what I've suspected for months. I can't have children, Robert. My body simply won't allow it. And I'm terrified that if I tell you, you'll realize you married the wrong woman." The words hit me like a physical blow. We'd tried for children for years, consulting specialists, following every piece of advice. Margaret had always seemed as puzzled as I was about why we couldn't conceive. She'd undergo every test with me, hold my hand through every disappointment. Never once had she revealed she'd already known the answer, already carried that burden alone. I remembered how she'd quietly stopped bringing up the subject of children after that anniversary dinner. How she'd started suggesting we travel more, focus on our careers, build a different kind of life together. At the time, I thought she was being practical, accepting. I never imagined she was protecting me from a truth she thought would destroy our marriage. The letter continued with her fears about not being enough for me, about how she watched me with our friends' children and saw longing in my eyes. She wrote about lying awake at night, wondering if I'd leave her for someone who could give her the family she never could. These secret letters were becoming windows into a pain I'd never known she carried. I set the first letter aside with trembling hands, my mind reeling. How had I missed such profound pain in the woman I'd promised to love and cherish? These true love stories we tell ourselves about knowing someone completely suddenly seemed naive. Margaret had been carrying secrets that shaped our entire marriage, and I'd been oblivious to her silent suffering for decades. The second letter was dated 6 months later, September 1978. In it, she wrote about watching me interact with my nephew at a family barbecue, how I'd lifted him onto my shoulders and spun him around until he giggled uncontrollably. "You would have been such a wonderful father," she'd written. "The guilt is eating me alive. Some nights I dream about telling you the truth, but then I wake up terrified you'll look at me differently." What struck me most was her misconception about my feelings. Yes, I'd wanted children, but I'd wanted them with her. When they never came, I'd gradually accept it as simply our path in life. If she'd told me the truth, it wouldn't have changed my love for her. It would have only deepened it. Instead, she'd suffered in silence, creating elaborate fiction to protect me from a reality she thought would devastate me. I found myself remembering small moments differently now. The way she'd quietly changed the subject when friends announced pregnancies. How she'd volunteered to babysit but always seemed emotionally drained afterward. Her enthusiastic support for my coaching Little League hadn't just been kindness. It had been her way of ensuring I had children in my life, even if they weren't ours. These emotional stories hidden in her letters were rewriting the narrative of our marriage. What I'd interpreted as contentment had actually been resignation. What I'd seen as acceptance had been quiet grief. Margaret had been protecting me from her pain while simultaneously denying herself the comfort that sharing it might have brought. The third letter, dated from 1985, revealed another layer of her hidden emotional world. We'd just bought this house, the one I now sat in alone, reading her secrets in the fading afternoon light. She'd written about choosing the house specifically because it had only 2 bedrooms, no constant reminder of the children's rooms that would never be filled. Her practical suggestions during our house hunting hadn't practical at all. They'd been self-preservation. "I've become an expert at deflection," she wrote. "When people ask about children, I change the subject so smoothly that even I sometimes forget the conversation happened. But you notice everything, Robert. I see you watching me sometimes with those thoughtful eyes, and I wonder if you can see through my careful performances. I hope not. Some truths are too heavy to share." Reading her words, I realized how exhausting her emotional performance must have been. For years, she'd crafted responses to well-meaning questions about when we'd start our family, protecting both of us from uncomfortable conversations. She'd become the master of redirection, suggesting we focus on our careers, our travels, our extended family, all while carrying the weight of her secret alone. I remembered a particular Christmas gathering where my aunt had made some thoughtless comment about us being selfish for not having children. Margaret had laughed it off. Grace. Fully, changing the subject to my aunt's new grandchild. Later that night, she'd been unusually quiet, claiming a headache. Now I understood she'd been absorbing that casual cruelty, adding it to her collection of private wounds. The grief and memory of reading these letters was becoming overwhelming, yet I couldn't stop. Each revelation was reshaping my understanding of our marriage, showing me a woman I'd lived with for decades but apparently never fully known. These touching stories written in her own hand were more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. By the fourth letter, dated 1992, Margaret's writing had evolved. The desperate fear of the early letters had settled into something deeper, a profound sadness laced with remarkable strength. She wrote about her decision to throw herself into her career, becoming the successful real estate agent she'd never planned to be. "If I can't create life," she'd written, "perhaps I can help others create homes where life flourishes." Her professional success, which I'd always admired and supported, had apparently been born from personal loss. Every family she helped find their perfect home was a small act of healing for her own wounded heart. She wrote about walking through houses with young couples, imagining the children who would grow up in those rooms, the laughter that would echo through those halls, all the things she'd never experienced herself. "Sometimes I wonder if you resent my long hours at the office," the letter continued. "The truth is, I can't bear to be home sometimes, surrounded by the quiet that children would have filled. At work, I'm surrounded by dreams and possibilities. At home, I'm confronted by what will never be. Please don't think it's because I don't want to be with you. You're the only good thing in this story I can't rewrite." The letter revealed her internal struggle with our childless life in ways I'd never suspected. When she worked late, I'd assumed she was passionate about her career. When she traveled for business conferences, I thought she was ambitious. Instead, she'd been running from the echoes of what our house would never hold, finding purpose in helping others achieve the domestic happiness that had eluded us. I set the letter down, overwhelmed by the realization that our entire marriage had been shaped by this unspoken truth. Margaret had built her life around accommodating my imagined disappointment, while I'd built mine around what I thought were her ambitions. We'd been dancing around each other for decades, both trying to spare the other from pain that might not have been as devastating as she'd feared. The letters from the late 1990s showed a gradual shift in Margaret's perspective. Her writing became less consumed with guilt and more focused on the love we'd built despite, or perhaps because of, our circumstances. She wrote about traveling to Europe for our 20th anniversary, how she'd watched me photograph ancient architecture with the same wonder she'd seen in my eyes when I held babies. "You find beauty everywhere," she'd written. "I'm beginning to think that's enough." These life reflections revealed a woman learning to find peace with her choices, even as she continued to keep them secret. She wrote about our garden, how we'd created something beautiful together that would outlive us both. "Maybe this is our legacy," she'd written. "Not children who carry our genes, but this place where love grew despite disappointment. The roses don't know I can't have babies, but they bloom anyway." Her letters described moments I remembered differently. Our spontaneous weekend trips, which I'd thought were romantic getaways, had often been her way of escaping baby showers or christenings she couldn't bear to attend. She'd become masterful at creating alternative plans that seemed inspired but were actually survival strategies. Even in her deception, she'd been protecting both of us. One letter from 1999 particularly moved me. She'd written it after we'd spent an afternoon with friends whose teenage daughter had been in a car accident. We'd sat in the hospital waiting room for hours, and I'd held Margaret as she cried for people we barely knew. "Your capacity for love isn't limited to blood relations," she'd observed. "You love deeply and widely. I've been so afraid you needed children to be complete, but maybe I've been wrong. Maybe love is enough." Reading these letters was showing me a woman slowly bidding to forgive herself for something that was never her fault. Her marriage and loss narrative had been entirely internal, a story she'd written in her own mind about failing me. But these letters suggested she'd begun to question that narrative, to consider that our love might be enough exactly as it was. The letters from our middle years revealed Margaret's growing appreciation for the life we'd actually built together, rather than mourning the one we'd never have. She wrote about quiet Sunday mornings, how we developed our own rhythms and rituals that had nothing to do with children's schedules or family obligations. We sleep late, read the paper in bed, make elaborate brunches just for ourselves. Sometimes, I think we've stumbled into a different kind of happiness. For perspective on our friends' lives had evolved too. Where once she'd seen only what they had that we lacked, she began noticing what we had that they didn't. David and Susan barely speak to each other anymore, except about carpools and parent-teacher conferences. We still talk about books, dreams, ideas. We haven't lost ourselves in roles like mother and father. We're still just Margaret and Robert, the people who fell in love over Italian food and jazz music. These revelations were reshaping my understanding of what we'd shared. I'd sometimes wondered if we were missing something essential, if our quiet life was somehow less meaningful than our friends' chaotic family adventures. Margaret's letter suggested she'd come to see our path as different, not diminished. We'd had the luxury of focusing entirely on each other, of nurturing our relationship without the distractions that come with raising children. One particularly touching letter described an evening when we'd sat on the porch swing listening to the neighborhood children play in the distance. Instead of sadness, she'd felt gratitude. Their voices are like music drifting over from another world, beautiful to listen to, but not our song to sing. We have our own melody, quieter maybe, but no less beautiful. Tonight I realized I wouldn't trade our duet for anyone else's symphony. These emotional stories were revealing a woman who'd learned to find meaning in what we had rather than mourning what we lacked. Her secret letters were becoming a testament to resilience, to the human capacity for finding happiness even when life doesn't unfold as planned. Yet she'd never shared this hard-won wisdom with me, keeping even her growth hidden behind her careful smile. The letters from the 2000s showed Margaret at her most philosophical. She'd begun to see our childless marriage as a different kind of gift, one that had allowed us freedoms and intimacies that parents rarely experience. We've grown old together without the intermediary stage of being defined primarily as parents, she wrote. I watch our friends struggle to reconnect after their children leave, and I realize we never lost our connection because we never had to redirect it. Her writing revealed a woman who'd found unexpected benefits in what she'd once seen as purely tragic. She wrote about our ability to be spontaneous, to reinvent ourselves in our 50s and 60s without considering the impact on children. When you decided to learn painting, I could support your dream without worrying about college funds. When I wanted to volunteer at the Literacy Center, there was no guilt about time away from family. We've been free to become ourselves in ways parents never can be. These true love stories hidden in her letters showed how she'd gradually reframed our narrative from one of loss to one of unexpected possibility. She wrote about couples we knew who'd stayed together for the children long after love had died, contrasting it with our relationship that had been sustained by choice alone. Every day we choose each other, she'd written, not because we're trapped by shared responsibility, but because we genuinely want to share our lives. Her observations about aging were particularly poignant. She'd noticed how we'd been able to care for each other's aging parents more fully because we didn't have the competing demands of our own children. When your mother was dying, I could sit with her every day. When my father needed help with his finances, you could spend weekends working on his affairs. Our love extended outward to our families because it didn't have to be rationed. Reading these later letters, I began to understand that Margaret had achieved something remarkable. She'd transformed her secret shame into private wisdom. She'd learned to see our life as complete rather than lacking, meaningful rather than empty. Yet even this growth, this hard-won perspective, she'd kept to herself, still protecting me from truths she thought might hurt. As I reached the final handful of letters, those written during Margaret's illness, my heart began to race. These would be her last thoughts, her final secrets, written while she was dying. The handwriting in these letters was shakier, the paper sometimes stained with what I now realized must have been tears. She'd continued this ritual of unspoken communication even as cancer ravaged her body. The first letter from her illness period was dated just after her diagnosis. "I'm not afraid of dying," she'd written. "I'm afraid of leaving you alone with all these unspoken truths." These letters were supposed to be temporary, a place to store feelings until I found the courage to share them. But 40 years have passed, and I've become addicted to secrets. Now time is running out, and I don't know how to break the silence. Her writing revealed the internal battle she'd fought during her final months. Part of her had wanted to confess everything, to finally share the burden she'd carried alone for decades. But another part of her had feared that revealing these secrets while dying would feel manipulative, unfair. "How can I tell you I've been hiding my true feelings for our entire marriage when you won't have time to process it, to respond, to help me work through it?" She wrote about watching me care for her as the illness progressed, how my tenderness had both comforted and tortured her. "You're so patient with my medications, so gentle when I'm sick. If you'd known about my infertility from the beginning, would you have loved me differently? Not less, perhaps, but with pity instead of respect? I've spent our entire marriage trying to earn love I was always afraid I didn't deserve." These final letters were breaking my heart, while simultaneously healing something I hadn't known was wounded. Margaret's fear that I would love her less if I knew her vulnerabilities showed how deeply she'd misunderstood the nature of real love. Reading her secrets now, I loved her more, not less. Her struggles made her human, not deficient, but she'd never given me the chance to prove that to her. The second-to-last letter was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Written just weeks before she died, when she could barely hold a pen, it contained her deepest regrets about our marriage. "I cheated you, Robert," she'd written in shaking handwriting, "not with another man, but with honesty. I cheated you out of the chance to love me fully by hiding parts of myself I thought were unworthy. I cheated us both out of deeper intimacy by keeping secrets I thought would protect us." She wrote about watching other couples her age, how some had grown closer through shared struggles while others had drifted apart. "I wonder what we might have been if I'd been braver. Would we have grieved the children we couldn't have together? Would that shared sadness have bonded us differently? Instead, I grieved alone and made you feel shut out without ever knowing why." Her final reflections on our marriage were filled with both love and regret. She'd come to understand that her protection had sometimes felt like rejection to me, that her secrets had created barriers even as she'd meant to preserve harmony. "When you held me during thunderstorms, you were comforting someone you didn't fully know. When you celebrated my successes, you didn't understand what they'd cost me emotionally. I gave you a curated version of myself and called it love." The letter contained specific memories that had haunted her. Times when I'd tried to comfort her during what I thought were work stresses, not knowing she was actually processing the grief of our childless state. Moments when I'd suggested counseling for couples who seemed to be struggling, not realizing she was terrified a therapist would expose the secrets she'd worked so hard to maintain. "The tragedy isn't that we couldn't have children," she'd written in one of her most insightful passages. "The tragedy is that I let that become a secret that shaped everything else about our love. I turned one limitation into a life thing." Time of hidden sorrow, when it could have been something we faced together, maybe even something that deepened our bond. "I'll die knowing I loved you completely, but never let you love me the same way." With trembling hands, I opened the last letter, the one that would complete this journey through my wife's hidden inner world. The date was just 10 days before she died, and the handwriting was so shaky I had to strain to read it. But Margaret had summoned whatever strength remained to write this final message, this last secret she'd kept from me for 47 years. "My dearest Robert," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found my box of confessions. I hope you're not angry with me for keeping secrets. I hope you understand they came from love, not deception. But there's one more truth I need to tell you, the biggest secret of all, and I pray you'll forgive me for waiting until after I'm gone to share it." My heart pounded as I read the next lines, unprepared for what she was about to reveal. "The fertility problems weren't mine," she wrote. "Dr. Hamilton's tests showed nothing wrong with me at all. When he called with the results, he explained that sometimes couples need to look at both partners to understand why conception isn't happening. But I never told you about that appointment, never asked you to get tested. I was so terrified of what we might discover about you that I lied and said the problem was mine." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Margaret had spent nearly 5 decades carrying guilt for something that wasn't even her fault. She'd protected me from potential infertility shame by claiming it as her own, never knowing that I would have handled the truth with far more grace than she'd handled her own deception. Her sacrifice had been both unnecessary and profound. "I convinced myself I was protecting your masculinity, your sense of yourself as a man. I'd seen how devastated your brother was when he learned about his low sperm count, how it affected his marriage, his confidence. I couldn't bear the thought of putting you through that. So I became the problem instead. I let you comfort me for something that might not have been my fault, while shielding you from something that might not have been yours either." The final paragraphs of Margaret's last letter contained both her deepest apology and her greatest gift to me. "We'll never know now which of us couldn't give us children," she wrote. "Maybe it was me after all, or maybe it was you, or maybe it was just the mysterious way life unfolds sometimes. But what I know now at the end is that it doesn't matter. What matters is that we loved each other through it. Even if that love was sometimes clumsy, sometimes misguided, sometimes secretive." She wrote about hoping I would remember her not as the woman who kept secrets, but as the woman who loved me enough to carry burdens alone. "I don't regret protecting you," she said. "I only regret that my protection created distance between us. If I could live our marriage over again, I would trust you more with my vulnerabilities. I would risk your pity to gain your understanding. But I can't have that chance, so I'm giving you these letters instead. My real self, finally, completely." The letter ended with instructions that brought both tears and a strange sense of peace. "Don't mourn the conversations we never had," she wrote. "Instead, have them now. Talk to me as you read these letters. Answer them if you want to. Tell me what you wish you'd known, what you wish you'd said. I may not be able to respond, but love doesn't require physical presence to be real. Our conversation can continue in whatever way feels right to you." As I folded the final letter, the late afternoon sun was setting through the attic window, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. I sat in that old rocking chair, holding 47 years of hidden love letters, feeling closer to Margaret than I had even when she was alive. These emotional stories had revealed not just her secrets, but the depth of her sacrifice, the magnitude of her love, the beautiful complexity of a woman I'd lived with but apparently never fully known. For those of you who've experienced love after 50, who understand that true love stories aren't always simple or perfectly communicated, I hope Margaret's letters remind you that even in our imperfections, even in our fears and secrets, love finds a way to endure. Sometimes, the most touching stories are the ones written in silence, carried in solitude, but no less real for being unspoken. And sometimes, even grief and memory can become gifts that teach us about the resilience of the human heart and the endless capacity for forgiveness that real love creates. If this story touched your heart, don't leave just yet. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey through love, loss, and redemption. Leave a like to help more people discover stories like this one, and stay with us for the next episode, another emotional chapter where time, memory, and love meet once again.